All right. Thank you, Kylie. So, if you are new here for a Wild Virginia webinar, we are a nonprofit organization, state-based, and we work on connecting and protecting your favorite wild places. So, we have two main programs that represents both Dave and I's program. We have a habitat connectivity program, which I run, and we have lots of important legislation and budget items that go along with that. But then we also have, which Dave runs, is our water quality section and also our pipeline section of what we do. So we have a lot of different programs here. I'm the habitat connectivity person, and Dave is our pipeline and our water quality person. We do also offer a lot of educational opportunities that go along with both of our programs and more. So I do recommend you check out our Eventbrite on our website, and we'll provide those links again in the follow-up email. And also the QR code here. Please help us out. All right. So first things first, we are going to go over habitat connectivity, and we're also going to go over the General Assembly legislation and budget amendment that were related to habitat connectivity from this past session, and actually it's still going on right now. Before I do that, I apologize if some of you have seen this information a million times, but just in case for those who have not seen this. So for habitat connectivity, we are the 9th worst state in the US for wildlife vehicle collisions. So pretty bad. Most of this is white-tailed deer, black bear. In 2024, insurance said that we had 89,000 wildlife vehicle collisions, and this costs around 41,000 in state and personal costs per conflict with wildlife. We see a lot of black bear collisions as well, which are just as expensive. And we see elk collisions in the Southwest, which are double what white-tailed deer collisions are. So about 80,000 per collision in state and personal costs. Through a lot of work from Wild Virginia and our partnering organizations like Wildlands Network, we've had a lot of successes in the past year related to habitat connectivity and trying to solve this issue of wildlife fuel conflict. So we created the Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridors Collaborative. This resulted in multiple different types of successful legislation related to habitat connectivity, like creating what's called the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan, telling our state agencies to come up with a plan to solve this habitat connectivity issue, this wildlife vehicle conflict issue. So we have two successful legislations in 2020 and 2021. And the first Wildlife Corridor Action Plan was completed in 2023, which resulted in some really successful federal funding awards. So we actually, VDOT was awarded a federal wildlife crossings pilot program grant to advance the results from the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan. And then also another granting organization included a lot of the results from this action plan in their planning process. So something that these are really successful. However, we have these wonderful legislation and this action plan put in place, but it doesn't actually require our state agencies to incorporate wildlife passage, so both terrestrial and aquatic, in any of their planning processes. So while they're doing this really lovely action plan, because we are the 9th worst state in the nation, we need wildlife passage to be incorporated in all infrastructure planning, not just a few crossings here and there. It's a very, very widespread issue, and so we need nature-based solutions to be implemented in our infrastructure from the beginning. So what's next? So these are the results from the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan from our state agencies. This is a map from the Department of Conservation and Recreation. So what we call WCAP is the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan, and it was really successful in showing us visually the issue of habitat connectivity in Virginia. So it showed us that we have these nexus areas where we have high wildlife vehicle conflict intersect with the green, which is called a biodiversity resilience corridor. That's current and future wildlife movement. So we have these, which you see in these little red hexagons, are the nexus areas. These are areas where we pretty much really need a wildlife crossing. because it intersects with wildlife movement and high wildlife vehicle conflict. However, there are some issues with the Wildlife Quarter Action Plan. It underreports the wildlife vehicle conflict issue by 5 to 9 times and mainly includes large mammals like deer and bear, which is not telling us the whole biodiversity story. But we did receive, again, federal funding to try to update this plan in 2027. In addition, the Department of Conservation and Recreation is doing a flood protection master plan for Virginia, so updating our infrastructure to be more flood resilient. However, they are not required to incorporate wildlife passage in any of their infrastructure planning. So that is something we are, again, really trying to do with legislation, is requiring our state agencies to incorporate wildlife passage in all of their infrastructure plans. And this is the type of crossing that we would really love. This is at Fort Belvoir in Virginia. So it's pretty much one of the only wildlife crossings that Virginia has. And it's really awesome because it does something called stream simulation. It simulates the natural stream bank, allows for aquatic terrestrial passage, and really amazing flood resilience. It also has fencing to corral that wildlife through the crossing instead of over the road. We're going to talk about stream simulation and these techniques in building infrastructure much more at a future webinar. So either use this QR code, please register. Trout Unlimited engineer Benjamin Bradley is coming to talk about this. So we really encourage you to come so you can learn more about what we're really striving for in Virginia in terms of engineering the type of nature-based wildlife crossings. That's April 17th. It's another webinar. It's also on our event page on wildvirginia.org. This is a map that we did with Wildlands Network. And what we really want to do in building more nature-based type of wildlife crossings in Virginia is try to solve a bunch of issues at one time. So we took the data from the Wildlife Quarter Action Plan and we combined it with federal data on areas that are socially vulnerable to natural disasters and areas that are vulnerable to high flood risk. So what you're seeing is in purple is high wildlife vehicle conflict. In green is biodiversity resilience corridors. So that's that high wildlife movement. And in orange, what you're seeing is moderate to high social vulnerability and moderate to high flood risk. So what we'd really love to do with any of the legislation or any of the budget, the funds and the budgeting we get for this issue is to target areas that overlap with all four. Areas of high wildlife vehicle conflict, high biodiversity, and high flood risk, high social vulnerability. As we can see in this, for me, it's top right corner. So we'd really love to first target funds towards these areas that have all four. And as you can see, it's not just on the coast, it's also inland Virginia. So it's a statewide issue. We'd love to put up a ton of crossings. But in Virginia, it's super handy. We can do that stream simulation technique. We don't need to make these beautiful overpasses. We can simply have an underpass. So it's a little bit cheaper in Virginia. So that brings me to, sorry, it took me a long time to get the background information. That brings me to our 2025 General Assembly. We had 3 things in the General Assembly for habitat connectivity this year. We kind of got a little bit ambitious. So we had House Bill 2025, Senate Bill 1341, and a budget amendment. We had wonderful sponsors, Delegate Gardner, Senator Marsden, and Delegate Simons. And I recommend if they are your representative, please do give them a big shout out and a big thank you for their work for habitat connectivity in the state. You can actually see Senator Marsden right here in the picture, right in the center. And also Congressman Don Beyer, actually, and Delegate Shin, she's in there as too. So we have a lot of connectivity champions. So please do thank them. So to go over the basic components of our bills, because they were a little bit involved, we were pretty ambitious this year. We had House Bill 2025. It's in 4 parts. So the first part was to mandate wildlife passage in road infrastructure planning. So like I said, we required state agencies to create a wildlife quarter action plan, but those state agencies are not required to take the results of that action plan and put it into actual infrastructure planning. So what we really wanted to do was to require them to come up with a full wildlife crossing program that they would consider both aquatic and terrestrial passage anytime they were doing any sort of infrastructure project. Now, granted, every infrastructure project does not need wildlife passage, but we at least wanted it to be something that they could build into most infrastructure projects, with an emphasis, again, on those four areas: flood resilience, wildlife field conflict reduction, biodiversity, etc. So we wanted them to create a wildlife crossing program. And this is in line with Federal Highway Administration guidance and Wildlife Corridor Action Plan guidance as well. This is specific to the Department of Conservation and Recreation, who are again doing the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan, who are building more flood resilient infrastructure across the state. We wanted to make sure when they were doing, for instance, a road culvert, which is what you see in the picture here, that when they redo it, they don't redo it to be a top image, they redo it to be the bottom image. We want it to allow for both aquatic and terrestrial passage and to have increased flood resilience. So we wanted to make sure when they're doing this master plan that they incorporated wildlife passage, because we were a little bit afraid that if they didn't, they were going to continue to build culverts that are like the top picture, because again, right now they're not required to do the bottom picture, and it is a little bit more expensive to do the top picture. Oh, sorry, bottom picture. So next part of House Bill 2025 is, in addition to having a wildlife crossing program at our Department of Transportation, was to require them to come up with a plan for how they were going to fund it. Not that they needed to fund it immediately, we just wanted them to come up with a plan where those sources of funding were come from. Give them some time to get creative with the budget. And the last part of House Bill 2025 was to help improve data collection on wildlife vehicle conflict. So like I said before, the current data we have is extremely underreported. So VDOT and the Virginia Transportation Research Council are already trying to solve this problem with the data. They are creating for their maintenance contracts, requiring whenever they go out to pick up a wildlife carcass on the highway, that they pinpoint what it is, where they found it, etc. So they started doing this in 3 of VDOT's districts. We want them to do it in all VDOT districts, so we get the best, most accurate idea of where wildlife field conflict is really happening. So that's House Bill 2025 in 4 parts, pretty complex. We just across the board wanted better data collection, more funding, and require state agencies to put wildlife passage in all infrastructure plans. Senate Bill 1341 pretty much mirrored House Bill 2025. It included at first all those 4 components. In addition, though, it included establishing a wildlife corridor grant fund. So we wanted them to collect diverse funds for wildlife crossings, but they needed somewhere to put it. So this fund would allow them to put those funds in a place that would accrue interest and have some guidelines to what projects would go to first. Towards the end of the session, pretty much the Senate Bill 1341 just became a bill for a wildlife corridor grant fund. And then finally, we had a budget amendment in for $450K. This was to support the Department of Wildlife Resources. This is the main organization doing wildlife crossing work, and doing the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan in Virginia. So this would give them funds to be able to do all the extra work we're asking them to do and go towards the highest priority areas to actually build or start building crossings. All right, so my least favorite part of the night is the outcomes. Unfortunately, House Bill 2025 and Senate Bill 1341 were pretty much killed. House bill was tabled in the House Appropriations Committee, which basically means that it was set aside for that session and essentially was killed. Senate Bill 1341 was just left in Finance and Appropriations Committee on the Senate side, which is essentially the same thing as being tabled, because if no further action is taken on it, it dies. So both bills died. We're going to go into it in a second. potentially why that happened. Although legislators, mostly Senator Marsden, who did a great job, included the 450K in the budget, but Governor Youngkin, as of this week, actually removed those funds from the budget. So what's going to happen next steps is the General Assembly session actually reconvenes on April 2nd, so next week. And the Senate and House are going to vote to either accept his amendments or not. If they try to get the money for wildlife crossings back in, Youngkin can then veto. Then we have to have a 2/3 majority to reverse his veto. Most likely, these funds will not be included in the budget this year, but we do encourage you to please contact your representatives in Virginia, and we'll give you all the information on how to do that in a second, to encourage them to put these funds back in. They are essential to getting wildlife crossings and reducing wildlife fuel conflict in Virginia. And I just wanted to include this screenshot here because this is kind of telling of what happened this session. This is from the Natural Resources Subcommittee in the House for voting on House Bill 2025. Despite myself and our really wonderful wildlife crossings team from so many different diverse organizations, Wildlands Network, Environment Virginia, so many, the Virginia Conservation Network. We had a lot of really productive conversations with both Democrats and Republicans, but for some reason, we had what's called a party line vote pretty much any time our bills were voted on, which means in this case that all Democrats said yes, all Republicans said no. So not quite sure what happened there. Definitely something behind the scenes happening. But especially if you have a Republican representative, I recommend kind of reaching out to them and asking them about this. So some other likely reasons. This was a short session. We didn't have as much time to advocate and lobby as we do in other sessions. We had some state agency pushback, so we are asking them to do more work. The Department of Wildlife Resources was largely in support because we wanted to also give them funds. If we're going to ask them to do more work, we were providing them with a budget amendment, more funds to help them out. The Department of Conservation and Recreation and our Department of Transportation had reservations because of the costs and that it would be more work and this fiscal impact. So VDOT did report a fiscal impact for our bills, said that to establish a wildlife crossing program within VDOT, it would cost $500,000. And they mentioned that a single wildlife crossing costs between $500,000 to upwards of $4 million per crossing. They did say that they would have to direct costs from direct resources from other places to cover these costs, and also for the carcass removal tracking application for better data acquisition, they said it would cost about $50,000. So a large reason why a lot of our bills failed is because of these costs. However, I do want to kind of reiterate some things that is maybe not happening at the legislative level or the state agency level, is considering the fiscal and hidden impacts of the work that we are doing. Yes, in the short term, these infrastructure projects are expensive, but we can get creative about where the money to pay for these come from. We can, well, not these days. In the past, we were able to use federal funds, but there are lots of private avenues to pay for these types of structures, as they're doing out west. But I also want to reiterate that a lot of the research that's coming out of this says that these infrastructure projects pay for themselves so quickly because the average deer vehicle crash is $41,000 per incident in state and personal costs, and we have about $60,000 per year in Virginia. One wildlife crossing will pay for itself in under 2 years, sometimes, and can reduce that deer vehicle conflict by 96%. So they are extremely good in the long term for our state agencies and the Commonwealth in general, and the individual especially. Right now, the individual and our wildlife are really taking the brunt of the impact of the wildlife vehicle conflict issue in Virginia. We are paying taxes to state agencies, but they are not building infrastructure that protect us a lot of the time. We need to build better infrastructure that in the end will pay for itself in flood resilience and reducing wildlife fuel conflict. And yes, it is rough in the beginning, but in the long term, it's actually better for our state agencies and for the individual and the Commonwealth as a whole. Especially if we're doing the stream simulation technique, less flood damage, debris clogging, and it actually lowers maintenance costs. So we really want to make sure in the future when we're doing legislation for habitat connectivity that we're considering wildlife passage during the infrastructure planning process, because this is where it's going to be the least expensive to do these types of projects rather than retrofitting them or doing it when a flood, washes out a road. So yes, it is expensive in the beginning to do these projects, but I want to reiterate that long term, we are probably going to be saving quite a bit of money. So, even though this year was a little bit disappointing for habitat connectivity in terms of bills, I really encourage you, if you're not already, become a Wildlife Virginia member. This is where I send out all the action alerts and advocacy resources to help you. And please do frequently, not just now, but contact your representatives in support of wildlife crossings and funding wildlife crossings, and stay up to date with your local infrastructure planning projects and comment on those, or attend the in-person planning meeting and talk about wildlife passage and flood resilience. These are our resources for doing just those things. So we're going to have someone put in the chat these links. We're also going to put these links in the follow-up email after the webinar. So find your representative. This is how you find who to contact in the state of Virginia. And we're also going to provide you VDOT districts and projects. So please do use, especially number 2, this resource to look up local infrastructure projects in your area. And it'll usually get you in contact with putting you on a listserv so you can stay up to date on how to comment on infrastructure projects. We have a current project up here in Northern Virginia for 495. VDOT is planning on widening the road, and they're not considering wildlife passage. So we're going to comment. We're going to go to in-person meetings. So I recommend doing that all year long. And then just for more information on DCR's flood protection master plan, I provided that link. And then they're collecting flood stories. So if your area was severely affected by flooding, especially with the past hurricanes, please do submit your story, especially if it was due to, there was a road washing out, there was a culvert that was not built properly. So please do submit those stories. So that is habitat connectivity. I am going to hand it over to Dave. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, thanks, Jess. And while I get this back up, and get to my part of the presentation, I want to start by saying again, I'm Dave Sligh, Conservation Director for Wild Virginia. And it says my screen sharing is paused. I don't know why. So let me try that again. I will say, while I'm trying to make this work, that let's see. That all of the work that I do on the water program in the general, I'm not being able to make it work, Jess. I don't know what the problem is.
Oh no. Okay. Let me put it up real fast.
Oh, sorry about that.
You saw something.
Anyway, as I was saying, all the work that I do, my colleague here at Wild Virginia, Jackie Goodrum, is a huge part of our efforts in the General Assembly on water issues. So I want to make sure to give her credit.
I'm bringing it up, Dave, if you need it.
Okay.
Just let me know.
Yeah,
I'll just do it.
Advance it for me.
Technology.
Forgive us, folks. I'm inept on this stuff, but anyhow, so you have seen, yeah, there we go. So you've seen Jess's story about working towards legislation on connectivity. Me working on water issues, there are, as you can guess, many, many issues that come up dealing with water quality and other water issues. And I'm certainly not going to try to go through all them for you. In part, I'm going to explain to you how Wild Virginia approaches these issues, what we do leading up to the General Assembly, and how we act during the General Assembly. Um, and then talk a little bit again about what happened with the bills we cared about and what we will do next. Next slide, please. So our approach to all these issues includes regulatory, policy, legislation. All those things are part of the package. And in fact, we do focus very heavily on the regulatory issues because we know that there are a lot of requirements already in the law and already in the regulations that need to be fully implemented and enforced. And very often that's not been the case. The reason I put this document here that you can probably barely read, the kind of the underpinning for all our water programs are something called the Campaign for Virginia's Water Future. We kind of kicked this off several years ago, and we had 55 other groups who joined us in this initial kind of platform calling for really systemic changes in the way we protect water quality in Virginia. So that's kind of our blueprint, and everything we do in whatever realm kind of grows out of those same concepts. Now, even though we think a lot, most of what we need to achieve can be done under current law, we still know that there are times when we can kind of strengthen those authorities, or when we kind of discover along the way that there are gaps that just have to be filled. Next slide, please. So one of the things, and I'm going to be stealing all kinds of ideas and things from the Virginia Conservation Network. This is a booklet that they put out every year that the 170 plus organizations, including Wild Virginia, belong to. And we're all part of kind of a unified priority list of policies and potential solutions on conservation issues. And so if you want a really broad understanding of what the conservation community is trying to do and why, this booklet is really useful. And this is where we, meaning Wild Virginia's water policy issue or group, we kind of channel a lot of our ideas through this agenda. Next slide, please. That's kind of a busy slide, but in the 2025 version of the Common Agenda, well, first of all, Jess had a great policy paper on connectivity. On water issues, we, meaning Wild Virginia, co-authored 4 separate policy papers. And again, those hit at the specific kinds of things that are already in our focus, what we work on in regulatory matters and in legislation. So they all fit within our focus. And we have to be very careful because we're a small organization and we have to maintain our focus on those things that we think we know best and can do best. But these are 4 of the kind of subdivisions of what we look at. Now, I'll say that when these papers are written, they're not always aimed specifically at legislation. In fact, they usually don't propose anything really specific as far as a bill, but they're intended to lay out the picture of what the situation is and what some of the solutions will be. I will say that legislators and a lot of other people look at these documents, and very often legislation can grow out of the ideas that are presented there. Next slide, please. So saying that, we help produce these 4 policy papers on different areas, we did not come out of that process, meaning Wild Virginia, with any specific bills that we wanted to push this legislative session. We have in the past developed specific language or helped with certain legislators come up with specific bills that pushed particular things that we had addressed in the common agenda. This time we didn't do that. And the main reason we did not do that is for our core campaigns with PFAS and with with pipelines and some of the development processes. We didn't feel like there were obvious gaps that we needed to fill through legislation. That doesn't mean there aren't things we could achieve, but we felt that it wasn't the right time for some of those proposals. So that's where we went in wanting to see what other people were going to do, but not having specific language or specific ideas of our own. Next slide, please. So again, though, with that common agenda, we, Jess and I, and our executive director, Calandra Waters Lake, who was on the board of VCN, we're all involved in the bigger process of taking whatever initiatives people come up with and deciding what kind of bills in the legislature we're going to support, what kind of bills we're going to oppose. So we're very much involved in that. And again, Jess and I show up at those meetings and we learn about all the different areas aside from ours. And very often I learn of water bills that I'm not going to spend lots of time on, but that are very, very good. And I can kind of help try to contribute to those at least. Um, Now, the other thing you find is that people come in with bills, legislators and other parties who aren't necessarily talking to us beforehand with things that we really feel like we need to oppose, that we feel like are going to do damage or cause negative impacts. So we're always on the lookout for those, and you have to be because you never know where they're coming from. Next slide, please. So again, stealing from VCN's materials on their website. There were 147 bills in the overall picture that VCN's partners decided to take positions on. 25 of those were in the broad category of what they call clean water and flood resilience policy. So that's a lot of bills. And again, obviously, we could not spend tons of time on every one of those. But they did aim at some broad goals, including reducing toxic pollution, which is one of our main issues with PFAS, and trying to prevent additional releases of PFAS to the environment. Next slide, please. And then you see as an overall result in that category of water and flood resilience, of the bills that VCN, that all of us decided to support through the process, which was, I guess, 23 of them, 8 of those we supported have passed through. And then of those we were opposing, 2 of them were defeated. So it's not an amazing percentage, but not bad. You can't expect to get everything you're looking for in this process. It's a complicated process. Next slide, please. So now I want to get to some specific bills that we did concentrate on. Next slide. This one from Delegate Campbell and Senator Perry, there were bills that mirrored each other in the House and the Senate. And once we found out about this one, this became a really high priority for Wild Virginia. It was to essentially help private well owners be able to sample their wells for toxic chemicals, including PFAS, forms of PFAS, but also if they have contamination, to try to do something about it, to try to treat that water so that they can use it. That's so important. Any of you know, especially in rural areas in Virginia, that so many people depend on private wells, and very often that's their only reasonable source of water. So if we can't help those folks, then a lot of people are just going to be left without any protection. These graphics you probably can't see all that well, unfortunately. The one that has the table with the yellow shading, that's a list of priority of water systems that have violations of PFAS drinking water standards. And the vast majority, and ones that DEQ has decided are high priorities to go find the sources for that contamination and solve them. The vast majority of them are groundwater sources. Now, these are group, public water sources. Doesn't have anything to do with the many, many private wells are out there, but it does give you an indication that there's a big problem and it's probably growing all the time. The image on the right is where the US Geological Survey did sampling, some in Virginia, but most of it in West Virginia. And all those purple squares are places where they sampled for PFAS and they found significant amounts. So the more we look, the more we find it. And so again, it's a big threat to a lot of folks, and we need to help them deal with it. So VCN voted to support these bills, these companion bills in each house, as did Wild Virginia. And as we usually do within the kind of VCN collaborative process, one group will usually take the lead in trying to follow those bills and organize efforts to support or oppose them. In this case, we took the lead on this one and put a lot of effort into trying to push these bills in concert with the two patrons in the House and the Senate. Next slide, please. So what was the outcome? After all that work, we did get a lot of support for the substance here. A lot of people, there were good votes that said, yeah, we think this is a problem and we'd love to do something about it. But as with some of Jess's examples, what it came down to was money, because this one had a companion budget amendment that would have required pretty significant state expenditure, and that just died in both House and Senate with very little ceremony. It was just, okay, we're leaving that aside. So we're disappointed in that, but again, it lays the groundwork for next time and for future work. I'll tell you from experience in Virginia and in other places, to propose a bill in 1 year and get what you want that year is not all that common. This is a long game, and so we understand that this one will be the same. So next slide, and on to another issue. So one of the potential contaminating sources for groundwater and surface waters, as well as crops and animals, is the land application of sewage sludge, because we know that a lot of that sewage sludge that comes from wastewater plants, municipal wastewater plants, has forms of PFAS in it. So it's important that that application be regulated properly for PFAS and for other substances. Delegate Runyon proposed HB 2517 specifically to try to allow for certain kinds of research. It was written for all institutions of higher education, which would include a lot of colleges and universities. And it would have exempted, or it does, under the language of the bill, exempts any of those institutions that are doing this kind of work to not follow any of the regulations that apply to every other circumstance where sludge is land applied. We thought that was a terrible idea. VCN decided not to take a position up front on this because, as is usually the case, when you have something that you're concerned with, people were trying to figure out how to make it better, how to avoid some of the damages that we could foresee. We went ahead and went against the bill immediately. We, contacted the patron and tried to get him to deal with us. We lobbied all the members of the subcommittees and committees who were involved, and tried really hard to narrow the scope of the bill. I will say that what we learned is that it seemed that this bill was likely to be applied very narrowly anyway, because there was some specific research projects that were anticipated. So we were not quite as concerned as we learned more about it, but we still opposed it. Next slide, please. Our opposition was not successful. It was passed out of both houses, and just recently the governor signed the bill. So we're disappointed in that, and frankly, wherever this activity happens, that will be something that folks will have to look out for. I'm hoping that this ability to apply sludge without all the requirements won't be taken advantage of, or at least not on a frequent basis. But it is disappointing. Next slide, please. Senator McPike with SB 1319 tried to include some requirements that would, again, try to deal with PFAS and specific causes or sources to the environment. What happens a lot of times in most major municipal wastewater treatment plants that take the waste from our homes and our businesses and industries, a lot of those industries are likely sources of PFAS, which then goes into that municipal plant and is usually not treated through the processes that they have there, and ends up in our streams or our lakes or whatever. So what Senator McPike wanted to do was require those industries that discharge to a publicly owned treatment works, a municipal sewage system, to go and sample and see if they have PFAS in there. Now, again, we think that's necessary. I'll say, from harking back to what I said about the regulatory process, we believe that the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality not only has the ability currently to require this kind of monitoring where it's justified, but that they have a duty to do so. And we have been advocating that through permit comments and regulatory actions for the last 2-3 years. So while we approved or thought that this was appropriate that it be done, we didn't want this to take away the ability or to make it seem as if DEQ doesn't already have that authority. And so we did make sure that there was a condition in this bill that said this does not relieve DEQ, or this does not impinge DEQ's ability to do what's already authorized under law. Now, VCN and while Virginia did support this up front with that kind of proviso, there were amendments made, and so we kind of dropped back because we felt like those amendments kind of weakened the bill, and that it frankly just was not in our interest to spend time supporting it from that point on. That didn't mean it was a terrible bill. It just meant that we didn't see the point in pushing it forward strenuously ourselves. Next page. So what's the outcome? Even though we believe that it was much limited and much weaker, frankly, than we would have liked to seen, it was vetoed by the governor in any case. As Jess said, that veto will be considered by the House and the Senate, but to overcome it, they would have to have 2/3 votes in each house. And frankly, that's not likely to happen. Next, please. This bill from Delegate Bulova was designed to try to help protect a huge water supply, Occoquan Reservoir in Northern Virginia, that supplies water to, I don't know how many millions of people, but lots of folks. And we know there's a PFAS problem in that reservoir. And so, with good reason, people want to try to figure out how to find the sources and stop them so that we can try to ameliorate the problem in that reservoir. Delegate Bulova's initiative was to say, okay, people upstream or people that discharge in directly into the reservoir, we're going to require monitoring of you. And we're also, if we find PFAS in those specific discharges, we're going to require you to take it out, or you're going to put limitations in your permits, so you have to treat that water and stop the PFAS discharges. Again, we totally agree with the idea of trying to protect Occoquan Reservoir, that water supply. There is no question about that that's the right thing to do. Again, though, we absolutely believe that DEQ already has a serious responsibility to be doing this already. And so we intend to continue to advocate on that level. Because frankly, fixing this in one place under legislation is not going to address everybody else's threats around the state. So we didn't take a position to support or oppose. What we did is we tried to work with Delegate Bulova to at least make this bill better and maybe head off some concerns that we had. As I said before, one of those attempts that we made was to say, let's make sure that there's language here that this does not wipe out any of the existing authorities. And Delegate Bulova amended the bill to include that kind of condition. So that was very, very important, and we appreciated that. There were some other details in the bill that we commented on. We got some improvements, but we decided that the bill, while it would do quite a bit of good, that we didn't feel like it was going to cause any great damage, and that it probably had a net positive effect. Next slide, please. So this bill did pass the House and the Senate. Now, the governor just the other day proposed a pretty minor amendment to the bill, and I suspect that will be approved or adopted by the House and the Senate. So on balance, this is not one that we have a lot of heartburn about, but we're going to make sure that we continue to push that regulatory angle. Next slide, please. This bill we outright opposed with no hesitation. The state regulations that require control of pollution from stormwater runoff were greatly strengthened back in 2014, brought in new technical knowledge, new requirements that really improve things. And that's for the whole state. Now, this bill would have allowed that to continue for everything within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, but for all the other places, the Roanoke watershed, the New River watershed, and others, it would have taken away those updated protections and gone back to the old language. Again, as it says here, VCN opposed it, we opposed it, with the obvious idea that why should parts of the state be protected better than others? Why should up-to-date ideas and science be imposed in some areas and not in others? Next slide, please. So I'm happy to report that I guess in the face of concerns and opposition, that Senator Pillion did withdraw this bill, so it did not go forward. Now, I'm not going to ascribe specifically what his reasons were, but I'm glad that it came out that way. Next slide, please. Okay, finally, as you saw before, we are co-authors of a pipeline policy paper, which was focused mostly on water quality issues. And we, of course, have been involved in the pipeline fights for years now. This bill is maybe not so primarily water quality, but it's really, really important, especially for folks who have a pipeline going through their property or near their house or in their community. What Delegate Razul tried to do here is to just amend the law so that intrastate gas pipelines had to include an addition to the natural gas that creates an odor. Um, a lot of people don't know that natural gas without an addition is odorless. And so it could be leaking and you not know it, which of course presents a huge threat. You can see this photo here of one place where that threat came to a disastrous end. Again, if you're near these things, or if you're with emergency services, somebody who has to go out there and decide where a threat is and what to do about it, this made absolute sense to just simply include these chemicals that would allow people some warning that a pipeline leak might be happening. VCN and Wild Virginia both strongly supported this one. Next slide, please. Here again, that bill failed, and it's inexplicable to me that it failed by a vote of 7 to 15. I have no explanation for that, why that is, but we will have to keep working on that issue. It's simply unacceptable. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm afraid that my story was not all that bright and shiny. Unfortunately, that's the way it works sometimes. And we were working on the defensive a lot of times with bills that we did not anticipate, but we had to work hard to at least try to make them better or oppose them or in any way we could. And we had some success. Now, what do we do next? Uh, as I say, since our primary goal or our primary aim is to make the existing rules work, we'll continue that. Now, one thing that happens when you do that, when you go to DEQ or the State Water Control Board and say, hey, here's a problem, you need to fix it, and they don't do it, then that gives us some evidence, something to go back to the legislature and say, see, we tried on this level to fix this thing. They wouldn't do it. So now you have to step up. That whole VCN process for developing policy papers and looking forward to next session, 2026, is going to start any day. If you don't know, it is an incredibly extensive and rigorous process, and we're excited to start on it again here soon. The last thing that we will do is to start to try to set up meetings with some of these legislators soon so that we can kind of lay the groundwork, continue the education, because once they're in session, it's kind of late to educate people. Things are moving way too fast. So we are committed to that kind of effort. Next slide. So that's it for me. Again, use the code there, go to wildvirginia.org, and I hope we can get to some of your questions and answers. So,
Yeah, awesome.
Kate, can you help us with that?
I just wanted to mention right before we get into questions, we're going to provide the link, but VCN, so the Virginia Conservation Network that Dave was talking about, they're also going to have a General Assembly recap webinar. So we talked about the specific bills that were relevant to Wild Virginia and what we helped with. They're going to go over all the conservation bills. So that is next week, actually, I think the same night next week. So we'll provide the link to that webinar as well. Anyways,
Great.
questions.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, someone asked, I asked VDOT to post a deer crossing alert here in Buckingham at the Yogaville community, and they said they need insurance claims for 5 accidents a year. What can be done to get signs posted when numerous accidents and deer deaths occur? Obviously, people are not reporting.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's like having more events like this. I'm gonna go back to my section where I had all the the links. Again, we're going to provide it in the follow-up email, but finding your VDOT district, that's number 2. And at this website, in this link that we're going to give you, is all the contact information for your regional VDOT connection. So it's super important for your community to reach out to those folks consistently, constantly, to talk about this issue. We also have, if you ever need like Department of Motor Vehicle information on deer vehicle collisions, Wild Virginia also has that information. We can give that to you to make sort of your argument a little bit more impactful, to help you get any kind of signage or what have you, any kind of mitigation efforts. I do want to say, if you have any sort of ability to look to see if you have underpasses under your highways in your districts, and to kind of say to your local VDOT representatives to say, hey, we could just simply add fencing to direct wildlife to these underpasses, and it will help us with this wildlife fuel conflict issue. That is going to have a little bit more impact on reducing that wildlife fuel conflict. But great question. We'll provide this information in the follow-up email, and I recommend reaching out to your regional VDOT representative.
Someone else asked, can you explain more about PFAS, what it is, where it comes from, and why it is dangerous?
Well, I can explain way more than we have time for, but the first is that it comes from lots of products that we use, weather-resistant clothing, nonstick cookware, firefighting foam, a lot of things that are of use that have been produced during the last 80 years or so. So it's everywhere. What we focus on, though, is that there are some easily discoverable and addressable places, and that those are wastewater discharges from industries and municipalities, and that sludge land application. Now, it's incredibly dangerous because in very, very small amounts, it can contribute to cancers, developmental disorders, all kinds of serious health impacts. And it doesn't go away. They call it forever chemicals because it does not degrade. It does not pass out of the environment. In fact, it concentrates in fish in our bodies. And it bioconcentrates, means as you go up the food chain, it gets bigger as you go up that chain. So it's in a lot of places, but again, the key to us is we already have a tool to stop some of it, some of the very important sources, and we need to take those first. There are many other things we need to think about, but we can't put off the obvious things to wait on all the other solutions. I hope that helps. I will say we can put a link in the link or two in the follow-up that gives you kind of a more general information too.
Another person asked, what is social vulnerability?
Oh, I think that's for mine. So in terms of what we were talking about, this comes from a federal database. We're talking about social vulnerability in terms of, it basically means, is your community more vulnerable to natural disasters? So do you live in a community that's kind of isolated from like a hospital or emergency services? Or would it be like if a flood occurred, would your community be immediately isolated? So it's social vulnerability in terms of how vulnerable your community is to a natural disaster, basically, and how quick you can get to emergency type of services. So again, that comes from a federal database, and we combined it with also high flood risk.
And then there's another question that asks, were there any bills Wild Virginia supported that dealt with water usage from data center development?
Okay. I'm going to have to include, first of all, we're over time, so I'm going to have to include some information, but I'm glad you asked that. There were at least a couple of bills that dealt with water supply. One that I specifically know was to limit the ability to transfer water from one basin to another, which of course is a can be a damaging thing for the parent, if you will, the watershed, to have your water exported to another place for a data center or whatever purpose. But without getting much further than that, I'm glad you asked, and what we will include is some more information about any bills that dealt with water supply. It would just be it'd take me a while to get through the rest. But is that all we have?
That's all we have. Thank you for being
Okay.
here. We know it was a little bit of a depressing update, but Dave and I are revamping for the next session in 2026. So we're going to be doing things all year long. So I really do encourage you to become a Wild Virginia member so you can get our action alerts and how to get involved. But thank you so much. And
Thank
thank
you
you to
all.
Kylie and our interns for helping out.
Yes, thanks.